Hello and welcome back to the Jessica Pinelli podcast. Nina, welcome onto the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
It is an honor to have you. And I was just saying off recording that we have never had anyone on the podcast that specializes in discussing grief. And I think I should say at the start of this, obviously, if you've clicked onto this episode, you can see the title. But just a trigger warning, we will be speaking about grief. We will be going into all aspects of it and diving deep. So please make sure that you are in a regulated capacity when you are listening to this. But I would love to start with Nina. Where did this journey on becoming certified grief guide start from? Where did this begin?
So thank you. And thank you for mentioning that if whoever's listening to honor their capacity, that's so important. I'm very comfortable with grief and death language. So sometimes I speak very fluidly, but please, if at any point it feels a little bit too much, by all means, like give me a heads up or let it be known. My story with this particular work started in 2019, September 11, 2019, to be specific. It was the day after we celebrated my brother Joseph's 32nd birthday. And it was a middle of the week, I believe it was a Wednesday. The next day, he passed away. We didn't know that was going to happen. I had spoken to him in FaceTime, 6 o'clock my time after I had left work. He was going to our grandmother's house to pick up our uncle's dog. He was going to take care of the dog for the weekend. 3 hours later, I get a call and it's my dad telling me he passed, and this happened. Come home. We need your help. And needless to say, life just shattered in that moment. He was my only sibling. We were very, very close. He didn't even spend a full day as a 32-year-old, and that was the end of his life. And life has never been the same since. I got thrusted into the world of grief. I had lost relatives before, but never this way or somebody this close. So I sought out resources for sibling loss, grief. How do you get rid of this? How do you move through this? I had no idea it was going to be this intense of an experience, and I had no idea what to do. My parents were absolutely devastated, so I couldn't ask them for help. My normal sources of support were not there. They couldn't be there. And even friends were ill-equipped to help. So I started researching, and there was little to no information. Keep in mind, this is 2019, which is not that long ago, but it is long in terms of the conversations that have happened about grief since then. This is pre-COVID. So as I moved through it, and I thought to myself, well, the worst thing in my life has taken about 4 to 6 weeks to get over. That's like the worst case scenario. Let's double that time because this is pretty bad. And in 8 to 10, 12 weeks or so, I should be fine, right? That time rolls around and I'm feeling worse than ever. It's close to the holidays now, or it is in the holidays now. And I'm devastated. Nothing, I couldn't connect with my life. I completely dissociated from my own life. It was complete and utter numbness. I was working in real estate at the time. I went through the motions of everything, but I was not relating to anything that was happening. So at that time, I called a friend whose mother had unfortunately passed away 10 months prior. And I said, how do you get rid of this? How do you get over this? Please, like, tell me anything. And she said, oh, honey, I'm at the grocery store right now and I'm in the baking aisle looking for little trays for my kids to make holiday cookies. And I was just sobbing my eyes off because I thought about my mom. And this is 10 months grief. And so she said, be so very gentle with yourself. This is for life. This is going to last a lifetime. And that thought terrified me. And I said, well, that's her experience. That doesn't have to be mine, right? That I honor her experience, but I choose not to experience it this way. Unfortunately, that's not how grief works, right? I learned very quickly we have very little say as to how long or how it moves in your life and through your life. So soon thereafter, and please stop me at any point if you have any questions, because I'm a yapper too. I'll keep
Good.
going.
Yap. I love a yap. Keep going.
Awesome. So that was 2019. A few months later, we went into lockdown in the US for COVID. So it's about 6 months later, March of 2020. And needless to say, that changed everybody's life. But suddenly we had this conversation, this big dialogue about grief and what does it mean and what are you experiencing, and people unfortunately losing loved ones left and right, and all the uncertainty about what was going to happen, not just with the loss of life that was happening, but the loss of normalcy that we were experiencing as a society, right? So it, to me, was a welcomed pause, not COVID, but the pause that we got to be at home and resting. Fortunately, I had a steady income. I know that that's something that a lot of people lost, so it wasn't very comfortable for many people. But at the time, it felt like a bit of a breathing space in my life. And it actually helped me kind of sit with everything that was happening and say, this freaking happened. Like this happened. So in that time, I'm still disconnected from my life. I'm still going through motions. I'm still working, but I'm searching. I'm very curious by nature. So I keep searching. And I kept running across things that were not helpful, that were very clinical, that were very linear. And I said, this
Some
experience is
examples.
not sure. So, like the stages of grief, for example, oh, you go through the 5 stages and you do this and meditate and you should be fine. And yes, sure. There's like an aspect to that that gives you some sort of framework. But this experience is anything but linear. This experience is anything but structured or prescriptive. It's very unique. And especially, for example, in adult sibling loss, we're called the forgotten mourners because everybody asks, how are your parents doing? Because that's assumed to be the absolute worst loss. So I can count in 5 years, I can count in 1.5 hands who actually asked me, how are you doing? Right. And that's usually, it was like my mom, my husband, like a couple of friends. Right. So it made me believe my grief wasn't valid and I needed to toughen up. I needed to get it together. Unfortunately, the more you try to push things down, it doesn't make them go away. You feel like they go away, but they just sit at the bottom festering and they're just waiting for an opportunity to come out. So I was, the lockdown loosened up here and I live in Florida. So we were a little bit, we were back to work earlier. And I remember dealing with a client, again, I was in real estate, and the agent said something and I just blew up at her because she did something I didn't like. And my anger just came out at her. And the poor woman, it was not her fault. It was that I had been bottling up so much of this the entire time. So that's when I realized I needed to do something. I needed to explore. I needed to do some inner work. And I did. I got a coach, but I got a career coach, thinking, oh, I can't work in real estate anymore. I have to do something else. This career coach, thankfully, was holistic in her approach, and she understood the deeper nature of what was happening of this transformation. So I worked with her for a year. Next thing I knew, grief work, which I didn't even know was a thing, but grief work called my name. And so I got certified with Megan Devine. If anybody has read the book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, she's the author of that. I studied under her. And then I realized, oh my goodness, there is so much room for this conversation and there's so much need for this type of support that is not just in therapy, right? Because therapy treats it on the clinical side. And as a caveat, a lot of therapists are not taught about grief. They're not grief therapists. There's a big difference. Grief is a natural, normal human response to loss and life-altering change. So let me say that again. Grief is a natural, normal human response to loss and life-altering change. The reason I say that is because if you work on a clinical setting, they will apply a biomedical model to a life experience that is absolutely normal. Some people will pathologize grief, one, because it's how you get funding for research, and two, because you cannot treat in a medical model if you don't diagnose, right? But if you look at grief, grief is different than, let's say, depression or anxiety. And what the space that I work with is, it is a human experience that needs to be witnessed, it needs to be expressed, and we do this in community, and it needs to be supported in community. So that's a very long-winded answer to how I got into this work. It was through curiosity, through leaning into my own grief, through wanting to amplify the conversations. That's how the podcast was created, the Grief and Light podcast. And what began as an exploration of my own grief all of a sudden shifted into a resource for other grievers who said, me too, same here. Oh my gosh, I've been waiting for somebody to say this. The conversation became bigger than just sibling loss. I started meeting people from different walks of life who have faced incredible loss of, and I'm talking like their entire family, catastrophes, medical diagnoses, one thing on top, like layered losses, one thing on top of the other, that you say, can a person really take that much? And what I realized is the human spirit is so resilient, but some people fare better than others. And what makes that difference? And I found that the difference is the people that were supported, especially in early grief, and they were allowed to express, versus the people that were not. So it's not that it'll ruin your life per se, although it can. It's that if you are supported, you are more likely to reestablish this new normal, if you will, in an empowered way with a sense of agency than if you don't.
Thank you for sharing all of that. There's so
much,
parts
yeah.
that what I want to know, but it was great. Thank you for sharing that. And I was just before recording, I was telling Nina, I know that some of you listening to the podcast for the longest time would know this, but I lost my mom when I was 18. Context now, I'm 31. And there were parts of that where I saw myself or I saw my experience. And just what you said, when it first happened, my expectation with my family, so I had my dad and then my two younger siblings. And I expected that with losing our mum, that we would become this close-knit family unit and we would love each other and be there. And so right about what you said. It's like the people you expect to get this support from at the time. I mean, I can see this fully now. They were obviously all grieving, especially my dad, all grieving in their own different way and trying to understand it. But I think at the time, what created so much resent and where I avoided actually grieving and leaning into what is happening and this huge life altering change was I expected to be supported by my family. I expected to be heard. I expected to be seen. And I never, ever resonated so much with what you said about therapy because I went to therapy maybe a year after my mum passed and I hated it. I hated it. And I was so confused because I thought, okay, I'm finally doing something. I'm finally, trying to work through this and understand like what I feel inside, why I feel so much sadness and so much anger. And I'm never going to say it didn't work, but the way that you explained is they don't know how to apply the clinical trainings to the a human experience, being human and those emotions. And I think that's exactly what I've never heard anyone put it so well to reflect that experience back on me. I never ever thought that they were trying to apply these clinical things to me just having a human experience. And I think that it took a long time. I mean, everything happens as it does, but it took a much longer than I anticipated to actually work through my grief and understand. And I was saying off recording to Nina that, it's not until the past maybe 4 or 5 years where I've actually started to dive in deep and allow myself to heal, allow myself to understand, forgive myself for the way I was in my earlier 20s. And I stopped speaking to my family for a period of time because I was so angry at them and I was so angry at the universe and the world. And why did I get dealt this hand? And I think that you're right. I was in the exact same boat where I Googled, how do I go through grief? What do I do about losing my mom? What are and then you come up with those 5 stages of grieving. And yeah, okay, it makes sense in a methodical way, but also it's not really meshing with me. And, I'm thankful for people like you doing this work and sharing this work. And especially now, because even you saying this happened to you 2019 and there weren't resources, there weren't really like assistance there. And I think that is insane. That's insane to me that in this day, I mean, obviously now it's progressing and we have people like you doing this work, but back when I was 18, all I got was those 5 steps to grief. And I think, anyone listening, and a big thing that I took from what you were saying is, and what I can understand of my own grief journey, it isn't linear. There is no, and I was exactly like you. I thought, all right, well, what have I gone through? I've got, I think at that point in time, or just before my mum passed, actually, I broke up with my first boyfriend who I'd been with for maybe 3 years prior, 3.5 years, first love. And that was pretty heartbreaking. And I did the exact same thing. I go, okay, that was pretty hard. This is how long it took me to get over that. Now let's kind of like 10x that because I've lost my mom. That's a lot worse than a breakup. And I just remember feeling in the first year that after, a month or two, yeah, I would have people check in, but it was like, why is the world still spinning when I'm still stuck here? I'm still stuck in the same day today, and everyone is still going about it. And think I resonate with you. I can probably count on one hand 2 people who genuinely were like, how are you, Jess? What's actually happening mentally? Keeping in mind, yes, a lot of my friends are 18, 19 at the time and not emotionally mature, but it's crazy because it was like, oh, how's your dad doing? He's lost his wife, or my siblings younger. My sister at the time was 12. Is she okay? Is she going to be okay? I remember having these conversations and thinking, but are you going to ask me, am I okay? I may be 18, I may be a bit older, but am I going to be okay? And you're so right. It's this journey where it's not linear, and I definitely feel a lot better at where I'm at now, but I still have moments where I all of a sudden, and you, I'm sure, I mean, it's still very fresh for you, but I'm sure you have moments where it's like, yep, it's, I'm going well, and then you may get a trigger memory or hear a song or smell a scent, or it may be a birthday or a Christmas or something like that, and it's all of a sudden all this emotion and overwhelm. And that's what I've had to, and I would love to speak about this, about the acceptance of grief. Is it hit me earlier this year. I'd had long period where I was feeling really good. I could speak about it and it didn't evoke the emotion of sadness like it used to. And it was my mum's birthday this year. It's the 13th birthday I've celebrated without her. And oh my goodness, I was so emotional. And the years prior to that, I wasn't. I could celebrate her, I could have conversations with my family. And this year, I remember being in my car with my partner, it's one of those ugly, shaking, crying. And I would just like to speak on this of, no matter how long it's been, there is always going to be parts that come up and evoke the feeling of grief and sadness. But also from your insights, why does this happen? Why can it be like, for me, it's been over a decade. Why do I still have this strong emotional response to this day?
Because you love your mother.
Mm.
So, first of all, I'm sorry for the loss of your mother. And grief lasts as long as love lasts. Grief, especially related to the passing of somebody that we loved, right, is how love looks after loss. That's one aspect of it, because it's not limited to that definition, right? Your grief for the loss of your mother is you're missing her, is the fact that your heart says, okay, I'm aware she's not here. I'm aware she's not coming back. We've gotten to the point where, yep, the permanency is real, sure. The mind gets it, but the heart is like, I miss my mom. It's her birthday. I wish I could be cutting a cake with her, or whatever you did on her birthday, right? It's because our person is, grief lasts as long as our person is not here. And that could be a scary thought to people. If you look at grief as sadness, grief is not sadness. Sadness is one of the gazillions of, I call it the color wheel of emotions that you experience in grief. It's just one tiny, tiny aspect of what grief is. If grief, I define it as a container for all of the emotions and the lived experience of life after loss as it relates to a person. And I want to put a caveat here, because it's there's grief in the loss of a person, pet, so the loss of a life. And then there's the everyday grief. Some people call it big G grief, which is loss of life, little g grief, which is the more everyday grief, like a divorce or loss of a job or terminal illness diagnosis or something like that, right? So I don't like to use big or little because it feels like little is less than, like it minimizes the loss for somebody. And at the end of the day, the worst grief, if you will, is your own because you're the one experiencing it. So it doesn't matter if you lost. I've seen people say, I grieve more for my cat than I did my mom. And that sounds jarring to somebody because in our mental map of what's more important, mom would be over cat. It depends on your lived experience. It depends on how close you were with that person, how many years, how that person impacted your life. And so the second thing I want to say is grief is extremely physical. And this was the aspect that surprised me the most because in my mind, it's emotional and perhaps mental. It is, if I were to put a pie chart and divide it into pieces, the biggest chunk of that pie chart would be physical. And that surprised me. Your body sometimes will alert you to when you're grieving before your mind is made aware of it. And this could be, you're dysregulated or you're tense or you're very emotional and it has nothing to do with your period. Let's say if you're a woman, like it's something that you feel sometimes before. And if you look at the calendar, you'll almost see it. It'll be a few days before an anniversary, a few days before your mom's birthday, a few days before the holidays. Your body knows, your body remembers, it has a memory of its own. And so when you lost a person, assuming it was somebody you loved, right, and cared about, if you lose a person, when you lose a person, your entire body responds and that memory stays with you forever. And sometimes, depending on how traumatic that loss was and the elements surrounding that, that's where a lot of PTSD can stem from. That's where a lot of people have to do work to relax that part of them, process, digest it. Your body has its own wisdom and digestive mechanism. One of the key things to doing grief is to move your body and do it in gentle movement. So if you used to do, let's say, and you could speak to this more than I can, but let's say you were doing high intensity training. Well, in grief, go for a walk, do yoga, do something that's a lot gentler, softer, be very, very gentle with yourself. You're in a tender state, right? So I just want to honor that. And I have spoken, in my podcast, I've had guests who grieve 30, 40, 50 years after. I met this mother who told me about her son. And I said, oh, when did he pass? She said, oh, 18 years ago. And I said, oh, so yesterday. Not literally. And then she stopped and she said, thank you for saying that. Because her mind and her heart remember it like it was yesterday. It wasn't 18 years ago. Grief time is not linear either in a way. I call it the 9/11 memories for those of us in the States. Where were you when 9/11 happened? And that was over 20 years ago, but almost everybody remembers because it was so marked, right? But if I ask you, unless, what did you do last Tuesday? Unless last Tuesday was something memorable, you probably have to sit there and think about it. So it's that same thing. Your body does the same thing. It remembers immediately, your mind, your spirit, all of it. So it is absolutely normal for your heart to be completely fine for years. And then 1 year, it's like, oof, I really miss my mom, like really, or whoever you lost, right? And I want to normalize that. Another thing I want to kind of go back on was the 5 stages, and I want to honor. So they were created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s, I believe. She was an absolute pioneer of her time. She did amazing work. Because of her, we have a framework through which we can frame death, dying, and loss, right? And the reason I say it went viral before viral was a thing, but she created this framework that was for people who had terminal illnesses. So the 5 stages were truly about how people get to acceptance that they will pass, that they are dying, right? It was never meant for grievers. And she even says this. She says that her work was never meant to be applied in this context. However, it was because it was the one that was, at the peak of the research back then, and it just kind of stuck. That's not to say that if for whatever reason you read the 5 stages and you have this amazing breakthrough and you just love the concept, please, by all means, use it. That's not to say, I don't want to throw her work away. By all means, if it helped you, go for it, use it. I divide in grief, it's simple. Is it helpful to you? Is it not helpful to you? Don't question anything else. You already have so much to process. If it's helpful to you, it's not hurting you, it's not hurting somebody else, by all means do that. If it's not helpful to you, then don't overthink it, just set it to the side and move on, right? And
I just have a question on that before I forget it, because I
please,
think it's
please.
important and related to that. Okay, so is it helpful for you? Is it not helpful for you? What if someone's listening, whether they are freshly new experiencing grief or whether it's been a period of time, but they have habits that they consciously can recognize? This, like, maybe it could be, I'll take my own example. There was a in my early 20s when this happened, I went out every weekend binge drinking. So at the time, that's great, it's a release, I'm with friends, I'm not thinking about it, and I'm going out and I'm, dealing with my emotions in quotation marks for the listeners in a weird way. So for me, that kind of felt like this is helpful for me because I'm some way feeling my emotions, but consciously I knew it wasn't helpful for me. So what do we do to bridge that gap or the understanding?
That's a great question. And in all fairness, I don't think, I'm trying to go back in my memory very quickly, but I don't think I've met anybody who hasn't done that immediately after grief. There is a period of you just completely being lost because your reality, the foundation of your life has just shifted. So, what are you really standing on, right?
Mm.
Every part of you wants this to go away. Every part of you wants to numb this experience and the intensity of your experiences. So, drinking, going out, partying, overeating, things that are calming to the nervous system, because ultimately it's an altered nervous system. It's normal in the sense that it's not an abnormal response to what you're experiencing, right? But like you said, there was a part of you that was conscious that this could become a problem or this could be dangerous. Like if you are so sad, you're taking a bottle to the face, getting in your car, driving. No. So
Mm.
that's why I say if it's helpful, not hurting you, not hurting anybody, not potentially hurting you or anybody, sure. So, what I mean by that is if the 5 stages of grief, the concept, if that's helpful to you, by all means, go for that. If saying no to the holidays is helpful to you because you're so overwhelmed, you cannot imagine a conversation having to explain what happened, or you really don't want to deal with the questions, by all means, don't participate. It's okay. It's well within your right. You have permission to grieve, right? Now, if you are engaging in activities that could be potentially harmful, that's a different story. And you might want to find different ways of regulating. Ultimately, it's a body and a mind and a system that is stressed. Your cortisol is spiking. Your stress hormones are through the roof. Like the experience is extremely overwhelming, and it's a system that wants to be soothed. So that's where you ideally work with somebody, and it doesn't have to be a therapist. Although, again, if therapists are helpful to you, do that. Find a grief group. Find a grief group. Join a grief group. Find a grief coach. Find a grief podcast. Read books. And like I said, the most important thing is move your body whenever possible, because there are days when you're not even going to be able to get out of bed, especially those very early days. That's okay. Sometimes all you need is to just be a pile of wet towels on the floor for a day, and that's okay. Come back the next day. And one thing that was really helpful to me is nature. I have an episode called Letting Nature Nurture You, because at the end of the day, we can't carry this by ourselves. And the most alchemizing resource that is usually attainable to many of us, if not most of us, is access to nature. So, for example, I live in Miami, go walk on the beach and just sit there, like meditate by the beach, zone out, and just allow the elements to nourish you and soothe you. You're not meant to do this alone. This experience is lonely because only you know who you were in relation to the person that you lost, right? But the healing aspect of it, and I use healing loosely here, is done in community and it's done with support. So I think that's very important.
What if someone's listening and they feel that they don't have the community or the resources to get the support, and they're in this position where they do feel very lonely? They don't know where to start. They're laying in bed and they feel it is such a struggle to get out and go for a walk. Where should they start?
That's a fantastic question. And there will be, I had days like that. And there will be days that happens, especially early on. It's okay. First of all, give yourself permission to feel that. I think when people say, I'm not supposed to feel this way and I have to do something else, and I'm laying here and I should be doing something else. So, permission to not should on yourself. Like, don't.
I love that because I was like that. I shouldn't be feeling like this. Or, even after a few months passed, I was like, no, 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 like I shouldn't feel this sad or this angry, or like I need to move past it now.
Right. If today, again, if today feels like you're a wet pile of towels on the floor, be that and embrace it fully, knowing that's not permanent. It's not going to be permanent, but you do have to allow yourself to feel it all. That is part of it, and sit with the discomfort. It's not cute. It's not comfortable. It's a wet pile of towels, if you will, right? Emotionally speaking. So if you are looking, you're like, I don't even have the energy to Google grief groups. I can't even read right now. My head hurts, right? That's okay. Then just sit where you are and allow yourself to be that. Allow what it is immediately accessible to you to nurture you. So, what does that mean? If you have a blanket by you, focus on the warmth of that blanket. And that is the most important, most healing, most incredible thing you could do for yourself in that moment and in that context. When you take a shower, let the water run through you and soothe you. Water is extremely soothing, and just let it run through, the top of your head all the way down to your feet, and just kind of sit in the warmth. Have a cup of tea. It's so simple. We always think we have to make this like elaborate, like I have to get a therapist now, I have to do this and I have to shift my life, and maybe later, but today this is what it looks like, and that's perfectly fine. There's a quote that it says, like, if all you did today was survive, then you did it. That's it. And that's not just that's usually when grief is very intense, very acute, very heavy. Now, if you notice that this pattern is like this for years and it's getting more intense, then you're talking about something different, right? So if the intensity of the sadness and the intensity of the grief is so much that over time, over the years, you are unable to function, you then need to look at therapy or getting medical assistance, because then you're talking about something else.
That was my next question. So, where is the point in your experience working with people and understanding grief? What's the point? And I don't mean that we need to put like an actual number on years or months or whatever, but what do we look for in, okay, now's the time where you need to get assistance or you need to seek out, like, what are some tangible signs that maybe you've seen in people as years have gone by, like, okay, you're not really dealing with your grief and your loss?
That is one of my favorite questions, so thank you for asking that. Here is where there's a split in the grief world, if you will. The ones that are trying to treat grief like a medical situation will give you a timeline that most of us grievers think is highly unrealistic, right? So the timeline that they give is usually under a year. If you've lost somebody, you know that even at the year mark, you still feel pretty awful. Like
Wow, that's
in some
insane.
ways.
Under a year.
Yes.
That's
And I don't
shocking.
want to give the exact time frame because I don't want anybody to put that number in their head, right? So I disagree with that. I don't, like I said in the beginning, and that's why I opened it up. I don't think it's a medical thing unless you have underlying medical issues like depression or anxiety or something else, right? Grief in and of itself is not a medical issue. So to give you an idea, I did a post with another colleague who works in the space, and she lost her mother to cancer. She had the unfortunate experience of seeing her mom slowly progress towards her death, right? I had a sudden loss, and so what are the differences between sudden and expected loss? So for example, one thing that we arrived in conversation is that it took both of us 3.5 years to start feeling okay again. And that would seem like a very long time to a lot of people until you start hearing their stories. And it's between like 2 and 4 years for a lot of people. That is not a magic number. There are people who within a month are okay. There are people within 20 years, they're still not okay, right? So it all depends on you. The the line in the sand, and I did an episode about this with a psychologist, she said is, again, if your thoughts are getting darker, if your ability to get through the day is getting less and less, if you are struggling, if the way that you feel is increasingly more difficult to deal with, like your everyday life, you may want to start seeking help. But if it comes in waves, like you said, the past few years I've been fine, and then this year it just really hit me, that doesn't mean you're going back. That means maybe your heart was a little more tender that particular birthday. But if every year it's getting more difficult and you cannot focus, you're more disengaged from your life, you're having thoughts that are not helpful and they're getting darker, you're having suicidal ideation, things like that. Like if it's getting to a point where it starts feeling almost threatening to your life and to who you were, then that's when you want to start looking for some help.
I think I saw that on your profile with the person who lost their mum, because I was exactly the same. I lost my mum to cancer and it was a progressive thing. And the interesting thing, and again, I know you pointed this out, but for everyone, you know, any number we put, it's not the number to go by. But I do resonate. I feel I was about 3.5, 4 years until I could start actually conceptualizing and working through and understanding myself, without kind of like, I always describe grief as a bit of a cloud on my head. It's like that cloud started to dissipate and I could see the world a lot clearer. But something I was just reflecting on when you were sharing that is, with the difference between a progressive loss and a sudden loss, is I, because I knew my mum was getting to a point where she was going to pass, there was an actual date and we knew logically this is going to happen. I thought I was going to be prepared. And I think that's what took me off guard. I think that I was like, you know what? I know it's going to happen. Of course, I'm going to be sad. Of course, like, you know, this sucks. And, you know, I just turned 18 and, you know, I start going through, my mom's not going to be at my 21st, my 30th, you know, she's not going to see me have kids. And I really started to, I believe probably in the last month, 2 months, like prepare myself mentally. Like this is coming, the date is looming. And of course, when it happened, I could not prepare for that. And I think that was one of the things I carried with me that was a bit shameful. And I would tell myself is, well, you knew this was going to happen. You knew roughly the date it was going to happen. Why aren't you? And this is what I would say to myself, why aren't you moving forward? Why aren't you dealing with this better? This isn't a surprise. Just like with your brother's passing, that was a complete shock. So for me, I felt a bit of shame because I would compare to sudden passings and think, well, it wasn't sudden. I knew this was going to happen. Why aren't you prepared? And I think part of it for me, and maybe you have some insight on this, part of it was that made it really difficult for me to work through because I almost felt like, well, you should be further along than someone else who experiences a sudden passing.
So thank you for bringing that up, and I have so much compassion for you. First of all, it's the equivalent, I imagine, because I don't have children, but it's the equivalent of being pregnant for 9 months and you know your due date, you know you're going to give birth, you've seen and heard all the stories, you have read all the articles, and you won't be the first, you won't be the last. But then the day comes and you're like, oh my goodness, like what is this experience, right? So in a way, it's like the other side of a birth. It's the death. And so it's like that. Yes, you could have, you can never be prepared for loss. It doesn't matter if you were literally prepared, quote unquote, medically speaking, with this is what's going to happen next, and you will see this, and this is the schedule, and this is what it looks like. They could tell you all the things. When the moment comes and you have to do that final letting go, nothing prepares you for that. Nothing. And so the shame that you express is common in terms of a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people say, I should have dealt with it better. I should have been more prepared. I knew it was happening. Right. And yet that's you're not talking about a test. You're not talking about a driver's exam. You're talking about letting go forever. And nothing prepares you for that. Absolutely nothing prepares you for that.
I
So I
like
have
the
so much
analogy.
compassion.
Sorry, I was just going to say I like the analogy because, birth and death of the pregnancy. And one of my friends I saw a couple of weeks ago, she recently just gave birth. Like her baby is 4 weeks probably at this point. And she has for the whole time, I think I've known her about a decade. She's wanted to become a mum. Like that's her sole purpose. And so she knows everything. She's read everything. And one of the first things she said to me was, holy shit, I could never have prepared for that. I could not have prepared to give birth and what happened,
Right.
and her baby's healthy and everything, but she's like, I thought I was ready. And I know, she's like, I'm so grateful. Like, I'm so happy I'm a mom, but I could not prepare for that. And I love that you brought that up because I'm like, that is such a good way to look at it is yes, we can be